Welcome everyone to what is the penultimate event of the 2024 Edward Thomas Literary Festival. For this event, we're delighted to present a special conversation between two of the most celebrated poets of our time, Sir Andrew Motion and Alice Oswald. Both poets have been profoundly influenced by the natural world, much like Edward Thomas, and bring their own unique perspectives on how poetry can capture the beauty, complexity, and emotional depth of the landscapes around us. Sir Andrew Motion, or Andrew, is former UK Poet Laureate, now living and lecturing in Baltimore in the US. He's known for his moving and reflective poems that explore memory, history, and the human connection to nature. His work often echoes the lyrical and melancholic qualities of Edward Thomas, making him a fitting voice for this festival. Andrew's poetry resonates, I think, with Thomas's themes of landscape, loss, and the quiet moments of life that reveal deep meaning. Alice is perhaps one of the most innovative voices in contemporary poetry, bringing a fresh, elemental approach to writing about nature. Her poems are alive with vivid imagery, often exploring the unseen and mythic forces in the natural world. Her focus on time transformation and the cycles of life draw a direct line to the kind of deep philosophical reflection on nature that poets like Edward Thomas so masterfully conveyed. Together, Andrew and Alice are going to engage in a rich discussion, I'm sure, about the influence of nature on their poetry, the enduring legacy of Edward Thomas and other poets whose work has inspired them, and the ways in which the landscape continues to inspire new generations of poets. We're really excited to be sharing this unique conversation with you. But before we start, I would just like to thank Arts Council England, National Lottery Players, our local district councillor Robert McAtter here in Petersfield in Hampshire, and other funders without whose support we would not have been able to bring you this year's festival, our most fully packed and widely engaging already. As you'll be aware, such funding does bring a requirement for us to provide feedback. And in the chat box on the side of your screen at some point, you will see links to feedback, perhaps through TripAdvisor, and also to Petersfield Awards, where Petersfield Museum and Art Gallery are hosts and co-presenters of this festival, have been nominated in 2 categories. We'd be thrilled if you felt able to vote for us before voting closes at midnight tomorrow. Our timing's perfect. But that's enough of me. I'd like to start the ball rolling by asking Alice and Andrew a question about Edward Thomas. And essentially, it's about whether or not you feel Edward Thomas is undergoing a renaissance at the moment, and if so, why that is.
Andrew, I'll let you start.
Really? Okay. All right. I was just going to say the same thing. I've been meaning you to start, but I'm happy to start if you like. Well, yes, I'm sure what you've just said is true, Jeremy. There is a renaissance in his fortunes going on, but I think it's perhaps not quite as recently instigated as your question implies it might be. It's certainly true that, I mean, if I can answer this in quite a personal way, it's certainly true that his fortunes have changed drastically in the now almost exactly 50 years since I started thinking about him seriously. And perhaps I can illustrate this by saying that when I finished my first degree at university, I had decided about halfway through my undergraduate life that I wanted to stay on at university, this is at Oxford, and write a thesis, partly for its own sake, but partly as a sort of preparation for the teaching life that I already envisaged I might be leading afterwards, in which that qualification was a sort of necessity. And in order to get this thesis underway, I had to go and be interviewed by the person who was then in charge of graduate admissions, who is the great Wordsworth scholar J.C. Maxwell, long since dead. So somebody who should, through the Wordsworth portal, as it were, have been sympathetic to Thomas. And I can vividly remember sitting with him in his rooms and him saying, well, yes, Thomas is a very interesting poet, but there are only 140 odd poems, and there is all this prose which nobody reads. Are you sure that there's enough here for a thesis? So I had, slightly to my surprise in that moment, have to defend myself against not a lack of interest exactly, but the idea that this was all very small scale somehow, that Thomas's work was small scale, and a kind of interesting minor figure in the background of the noisier and more arresting developments, which are almost contemporary with his own writing of high modernism. I would be extremely surprised these days to find that attitude, the one voiced by Maxwell on that day, alive now. So something has changed very dramatically in the last 50 odd years. And I once told this little story to Edna Longley, the great Thomas advocate and scholar, and said that I now wouldn't be surprised to hear Thomas's name mentioned on the Arches back in the UK. And we had a little chuckle about that. And then she wrote to me about a fortnight later and said she had just heard his name was in fact mentioned on the Arches. So maybe whoever writes the Arches had been listening to our conversation and had sort of decided to do something about it. So yes, I mean, this is a long way. I'm taking a long time to say a very simple thing, which is that something has changed. The other part of your question, why has it changed? Well, I think it has something to do with Thomas himself. It's something to do with larger things. And the things that strikes me most powerfully about that might be to do with Thomas himself is the fact that it can take quiet voices like his a long time to make themselves heard, especially if what they're, as it were, competing with is something that does make a lot of noise and has absorbed most of the critical attention given to that period, which is, again, to say modernism. When I started writing about Thomas, my feeling was, and I think this was probably generally held, that by expressing an interest in Thomas and to that extent identifying myself with him, I was sort of sidling up to a kind of right-wing view of what English poetry was and should be, whereas the modernists were the people who were kind of, as it were, lefty and radical, and even though, of course, they weren't actually in their own voting habits, far from it. But that binary view of the evolution of writing in the UK from sort of 1900 through to 1930 has itself changed very much now. People have and in my view, quite rightly, have a much more accepting view of two seemingly quite distinct ways of writing, not being quite so adversarial as they used to seem. So there's that, and there's also a larger point, I think, about our interest these days in writers who are engaged with the environment in one way or another, because that is the great crisis and the subject of our time. And Thomas clearly has something to say about all that. So it's a mixture of personal qualities, perhaps taking a little bit of time to realize, combined with larger issues.
Yes, thank you. That's interesting. Yeah, because Alice, we were speaking earlier, weren't we, about him being a quiet voice. But do you have any other thoughts or similar thoughts?
Well, I love his quietness, and I've been really loving sort of reading a bit more of him since you asked me, Jeremy, to take part in this. And I was also admitting before Andrew arrived that actually I am one of those people who have a little bit overlooked Thomas. And it's not so much the loudness of the modernists, although I admit I quite like the loudness of the modernists, but the sort of revolutionariness, I think, of Ted Hughes has, I think, struck a different and very important note for the environment, which I think is so different from Thomas's that it's quite natural in a way to fall on one side or the other, even though both are totally essential. I do think that young people of my children's generation, are full of a longing at the moment for poems about the natural world that have the sort of quiet authenticity of Edward Thomas. And I notice they're also very drawn to Seamus Heaney, who I think has a similar register of almost, I would call it, a nobility. There's something very sort of human and dignified about both of them. They remain human, I think, in their encounters with the natural world. Whereas I feel with Ted Hughes, he is a phenomenal kind of shapeshifter, sort of Norse hero, kind of northern teeth in the wind kind of singer. And I'm just so happy that we have such a variety of types of voices speaking on behalf of the natural world. And I really want to hear both of them. And I'm just very full of the pleasures, actually, of having sort of drenched myself in Edward Thomas for the last few weeks. It's been a real unlooked for pleasure. So thank you for that. I don't know that I've given such coherent sort of reasons and thinkings as Andrew for sort of why he should be coming back if he has. And that's partly because I don't think I've tracked it that closely myself, so I don't really feel qualified to say that.
Yeah.
It is. Sorry, Jeremy. Can I
No,
just?
please.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's everything that Alice has said. I find it, of course, extremely sympathetic, and I share her fondness for modernist writers as well, and their comparative noisiness. It is perhaps one way of elucidating this a little bit more is to notice who else during this same time period has changed in reputational terms very dramatically. Ivor Gurney was not on the radar. I mean, well, he was on the radar for people who were interested in him in a very particular way, but his reputation now is very much larger than it was 50 years ago, which has something to do with the complexity of his manuscripts. So there is a kind of material dimension to thinking about the change in his poetic fortunes. And the same, of course, applies to John Clare too, whose manuscripts were also in a great state of confusion 50 years ago compared to the state that they're in now. So there is a kind of editorial aspect to both those people. But of course, they are both people too who are very committed to writing about environmental matters in one way or another. So perhaps this shift in Thomas's fortunes, insofar as it does have something to do with our interest in our contemporary interests, and so it should be in writing about the environment, is reflected in the change in their fortunes as well.
I'm very interested, Andrew, in the phrase that comes in one of Hughes's essays about the environmental revolution, where he, and I quote it far too often, I think, but he says, "What alters the imagination alters everything."
Right.
And I think that idea of altering the imagination, I mean, it's quite a kind of strenuous demand, that. And I wonder if you think that Thomas alters or confirms our imagination. I think that's been my kind of slight anxiety about his poetry, which has not really been borne out by reading it, actually, but the sense of things keeping as they are rather than that Hughesian kind of overturning, which may be necessary if we're going to really approach.
Absolutely. And like you, one of the reasons I love Ted Hughes's poems as much as I do is that sense that you've been alluding to, of how he kind of hurls language around to make it new in a way that Thomas very rarely does, if ever. But I think a narrower answer to your question perhaps has to do with something that seems to me completely central to the way Thomas's poems work, which is to say that they are, for all their amazing freshness and sense of spontaneity, which is both there in his apprehension of the things that he's looking at, but is also wonderfully, for me, dramatized by the way that the poems actually work, particularly in their line breaks and the unit that a sentence is, the unit that a line is, the unit that a thought is, the unit that a phrase is. These are characteristically very interestingly playing against each other all the time, looking for contradictions and ambiguities and suspenses and all kinds of things. So that freshness, that sense of newness in him, which is the quality that lifts him above the other Georgians, and above most of his contemporaries working in that sort of stream of writing, as it were, is combined with something that is frankly very literary. And when we look at trees, birds, whatever it is, whatever the kind of details of his poems are, I think we see simultaneously the freshness that I've just been mentioning, combined with a very deep sense of literary history, which in other hands might easily turn out to look or feel a little bit fusty, but never does in him. So there is a simultaneous honoring of ancient things and an interest in revitalizing the imaginative response to them, I think.
I agree with that, and I very much catch in him that kind of primary English sound of iambic pentameter, which is,
Very much so.
as you say, he's kind of working against it, because he almost, I mean, he seldom ends the line at the end of the line, but
Right.
they're palpably there. And the tunes that he's making out of this extraordinary capacity to sound like a speaking voice, he is making them within that grid
Exactly.
mostly.
Yeah, that's it.
Which I think is what gives it its echoey feel, you know,
Yeah,
and
I
I
agree.
love that. So you feel, you keep thinking, oh, hang on, am I hearing Clare, or am I
Yes.
hearing Shakespeare, or
Absolutely.
what is it I'm hearing?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that is, yeah, that is primarily coming from, I suppose it's more of a European meter than an English one, but it's become very English sounding.
No, quite. I mean, I think you can hear that his ear really is, it's not the only meter he writes in, but his ear is basically interested in the iambic pentameter. That's the sort of default setting of the poems. But it's comparatively rare to read a poem by him which is chopped into those units in an immediately recognizable way. It's much more often kind of spread across several lines, or left hanging by the line break, so that you're not quite sure what you're going to find when you turn around the corner of the line, or I mean, all the things that we've both been saying. That's what animates the poems for me and makes them so fascinating, I think. But
they do depend on a knowledge of that, I think. I think the tunes really do demand that the reader can hear that particular meter happening.
Yeah, I agree. But if you put him in your mind's ear next to his great friend Robert Frost, for instance, you can hear that Frost's use of the iambic pentameter, which is also his default setting, is much, much more regular. And the regularity of it leads him, Frost, I think, characteristically, into a much more, something more nearly argumentative or opinion-giving way of writing than you characteristically find in Thomas, who is so much more in two-mindedness about everything, as Frost himself realized. Two paths diverge in the forest, you know.
Andrew, I know there was a Frost and a Thomas you might have read out. Would that be a moment?
I think it sounds like a moment.
Well, shall I mean, I very much want to hear you do the same sort of thing, perhaps with Thomas and Clare, but shall I say something, since we're now talking about Frost? Shall I just get on with this? I thought it would be interesting, I hope it'll be interesting, Jeremy, for people to hear and see the sort of thing I've just been trying to talk about, perhaps by comparing a poem by Thomas about a bird and a poem by Frost about a bird. And the Frost poem that I've chosen is The Oven Bird, which is a poem that is in his Frost's third collection. So written probably around the sort of time that Thomas's life was coming to an end. It's a pretty well-known poem, this, but if I may, I'll quickly read it, and then I'll say something about it.
Yes, please.
The Oven Bird. Funnily enough, an oven bird landed in my garden yesterday, as though it was encouraging me to do what I'm about to do.
It happens.
It does. There is a singer everyone has heard, loud, a midsummer and a midwood bird, who makes the solid tree trunks sound again. He says that leaves are old, and that for flowers midsummer is to spring, as 1 to 10. He says the early petal fall is past, when pear and cherry bloom went down in showers, on sunny days a moment overcast. And comes that other fall, we name the fall. He says the highway dust is over all. The bird would cease and be as other birds, but that he knows in singing not to sing. The question that he frames in all but words is what to make of a diminished thing. That, what question that he frames in all but words, I think looks over its shoulder, the phrase looks over its shoulder back to a phrase of Thomas's, which we're going to hear in a moment, and hear more versions of, perhaps in other poems that we talk about. But so to that extent, there is a kind of strong link between the poem and Thomas, but to speak in broader terms, this poem really seizes on the oven bird and wrings out of it meanings and significances that Frost wants to share with us in a way that we very seldom find in Thomas. It has a kind of clarity about its purpose and a kind of intendedness that we seldom find when Thomas is writing about birds. And to prove that, I hope, let me read The Unknown Bird, which was published in Poems 1915. 3 lovely notes he whistled, too soft to be heard if others sang, but others never sang in the great beechwood all that May and June. No one saw him, I alone could hear him, though many listened. Was it but 4 years ago, or 5? He never came again. Oftenest when I heard him, I was alone, nor could I ever make another hear. La, 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 he called, seeming far off, as if a cock crowed past the edge of the world, as if the bird or I were in a dream. Yet that he travelled through the trees and sometimes neared me was plain, though somehow distant still he sounded. All the proof is, I told men what I had heard. I never knew a voice, man, beast, or bird, better than this. I told the naturalists, but neither had they heard anything like the notes that did so haunt me. I had them clear by heart and have them still. 4 years or 5 have made no difference. Then as now, that la, la, la was bodilously sweet. Sad more than joyful it was, if I must say that it was one or other. But if sad, 'twas sad only with joy too, far off for me to taste it, too far off for me to taste it. But I cannot tell if truly never anything but fair the days were when he sang, as now they seem. This surely I know, that I who listened then, happy sometimes, sometimes suffering a heavy body and a heavy heart, now straightway, if I think of it, become light as that bird wandering beyond my shore. This poem, like so many of the poems in which birds appear, written by Thomas, or in other poems actually addressed to and more specifically about birds, is very characteristic of the way that he treats them, which is to put them as if, set them at a place at the edge of experience, as if the bird or I were in a dream. And not to try and analyze the noise they make, the music they make, as though it's something which is susceptible to human reason, but to suggest that its value lies in what can't be stated exactly in human terms. And that's the difference between him and Frost, I think. Frost wants the sound that birds make to be intelligible to us. And when he does mention them, as in The Oven Bird, he does a good deal of interpreting, so that we realize his poem is about diminishment in various ways. But in Thomas, it's about something much more nebulous, on the edge of sayable, on the edge of consciousness even.
I
Yeah.
find that incredibly interesting. And I just couldn't possibly say which poem I prefer. I love them both.
Right,
so
me too.
much.
Yes.
And they're sort of inside outs of each other.
Yes.
Frost
Yes.
is so kind of immaculately made.
Yeah.
And in spite of appearing to compel the bird to say something comprehensible, actually his tune is so intoxicating that he manages to say more than what he says because of the tune.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think that Thomas is sort of doing it the other way around. He's sort of surrendering to the mystery of not speaking bird language.
Indeed.
And
Indeed.
using a tune that is so much more delicate that actually it possibly doesn't intoxicate. It fills you with a sort of melancholy, whereas I think Frost's tunes actually kind of they lift you up. They're just so they're so incredibly powerful.
Yeah. No, they affirm, don't they, in some
yeah,
sort of
they do.
way when they're short. Yes.
And I'm really, really interested in this whole thing of the sort of gap between bird language and human language, and my sort of fantasy perhaps, but anyway, very strong belief, is that poetry really does come from birdsong. And I know that a lot of the Scottish Gaelic songs and poems were literally taken from the calls of birds. They quite often will try to sort of articulate in bird language the sort of refrains of their songs and poems. The pipers would tune their pipes quite often to an actual bird call. Because they didn't have musical notation, they could communicate very simply what the tune was doing by referring to a bird. So it's as if there's this kind of, without the use of paper and the alphabet, they had this kind of middle language, which was bird language, through which they could communicate melody. And my belief is that that really is kind of at the basis of all poetry.
Yes.
And possibly the birds were already themselves imitating water. Then the humans imitate the birds. And so you get this kind of natural landscape already in poetry. And I suppose that's one of the things I really took from Hughes kind of early on, when I sort of shifted from a quite academic life into a gardening life. It was suddenly the sounds that I found in Hughes that really felt as if there had been no kind of, he's very literary, Hughes, but it felt like he'd stripped away the sort of formalization that literature has given to those natural sounds and taken them back to what they were. And I really think that the birds are our indigenous poets. I mean, the clearances got rid of all, our country, unfortunately, has been full of clearances of those oral traditions. We don't really have them anymore, but they were originally taken from the birds. And so I think the birds they're the real ancestors of our poetry. And those are the kind of cries that we need to listen to hear what this country's poetry really is, because, iambic pentameter it's a European meter. It's not really the thing that's come up through the earth. But thank you for that comparison, because it's just, they're so beautifully opposite, aren't they?
Aren't they? I mean, they clearly are in conversation with each other as though to demonstrate their difference. I mean, I'm longing to hear what you're going to say about Claire, but just quickly before I forget this, at the risk of telling a story which will take up too much time, I think what we're talking about here is very interesting, related to Frost's ideas about the sound of sense. I mean, Frost gets into various sort of little knots when he's trying to explain what on earth he means by it, but it's really I mean, to put it simply, the idea that a sentence has a sound that conveys its meaning in ways that mean that we don't have to depend on the dictionary definition of the words that the sentence contains. And this is something that I've been very interested in for a long time now, and I know you have too, Alice. And I was recently reading a book by a guy called Rothenstein, I think, called Why Do Birds Sing? And in it, there's a story about a starling, starlings being, of course, very good mimics, that had been kept in a cage in a laboratory somewhere, rather uncharacteristically, considering how chatty starlings are, not saying anything. But one day it got a claw infection, and when it saw the veterinarian coming towards it wearing a white coat and carrying a hypodermic, it did say something. And what it said was, "I have a question." In other words, having not spoken for absolutely ages, but listening to the people moving around in the lab, it identified the sound pattern, which we understand as "I have a question," or we voice as "I have a question," to mean confusion, bafflement, anxiety, all these things. And that to me is the sound of sense. Isn't it wonderful?
That's a beautiful story. Did he follow it up with a very complicated question?
No, that was it.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Alice, if that sort of follows on from, again, something else you were saying about drawing attention to different ways of listening. And I wonder if you've got a Ted Hughes or a Claire example that you might read to that effect.
Yeah, it brings to mind, there's an amazing essay by Seamus Heaney where he talks about, I think it's called Englands of the Mind. And he talks about the fact that Hughes, Larkin and Geoffrey Hill are all writing about England, but they're all listening intently, but they've got they're hearing a different sound. And it's something I think it's important when one sort of rather sort of dutifully says that, you know, we must listen to the natural world, we must pay attention, we must, you know, create a voice out of natural sounds and stuff. Actually, that's not even far enough, because all these sounds are being filtered anyway through the imagination. So we also have to make sure that the imagination is clear, elated, you know, all the things that one wants the imagination to be. And I would say that Claire, Hughes, and Thomas, you know, one could write an equivalent essay to Seamus Heaney's, just saying that they are all three listening, quite often listening to birds and hearing something very, very different. And I think that Hughes's listening is using what I call the Esperanto of mythology. You know, some people think that mythology is this kind of fantastical, sort of intoxicated religious discipline, but I actually think it's very much, mythology is generally a description of things that aren't mortal, which are generally plants. It's sort of a sense of vegetation, I think, mythology. And in using such a sort of mythological sense, I think Hughes is opening up this kind of third space in which the natural world and the human world can find equivalent. So it's not that he's sort of projecting human dreams onto birds or onto trees or something. It's that he's finding a middle space where a language that is neither human nor bird nor vegetal is kind of interpreting for both of them. So I suppose an obvious example of that is his crow poems, which are incredibly crowy, but also just strangely sort of mystical and human as well. And because he is so sort of steeped in that mythological sense, he is using much more ecstatic rhythms. He tends to kind of come in with a stress straight away. His rhythms are often based on hexameter rather than pentameter, and hexameter is a really tripping, dancing rhythm. So Hughes's poems are made of these sort of these smashed up hexameters, which means that whatever bit you take, you've always got a sort of generally a very strong first syllable, and then you'll have some kind of trickling light-footedness going on. So the experience of reading a Hughes poem is really to be lifted into a sort of, I suppose he might call it a kind of shamanic dance, where you are participating in the animal's life rather than, I think the beautiful thing about Thomas is the animal life is sort of peripheral, but with Hughes you participate and you encounter the creature. And then Claire again is, I think, different again, because where Thomas is kind of very much throwing out the human syntax of walking. You know, when you walk, you sort of create a human narrative for your thinking, because you're carrying your head across the landscape. So you're sort of making a human sound as you go along. But Claire was quite often working. And the experience, I think, of working outside in the natural world is you've generally sort of got your head down, so you're not really in control of the impressions that come at you. And a Claire poem is a really bombarded and interrupted poem. He actually uses, you know, he uses that formal sonnet form almost all the time, but he interrupts it. You never get the sense of one train of thought sort of carrying through. Each couplet will bring in something different. And I can only really illustrate that by perhaps reading. I mean, I'd love to read, I wouldn't mind reading a Hughes and a Claire. Would that be too much?
No, I think that would be lovely.
So we talked about the pure thrush word, the thrush. Perhaps should I read that to start with, the Thomas poem that's quite similar to the one Andrew read. This one's called The Word. There are so many things I have forgot, that once were much to me or that were not, all lost, as is a childless woman's child and its child's children, in the undefiled abyss of what can never be again. I have forgot, too, names of the mighty men that fought and lost or won in the old wars, of kings and fiends and gods and most of the stars. Some things I have forgot that I forget, but lesser things there are, remembered yet than all the others. One name that I have not, though 'tis an empty, thingless name, forgot, never can die, because spring after spring, some thrushes learn to say it as they sing. There is always one at midday, saying it clear and tart, the name, only the name I hear, while perhaps I am thinking of the elder scent that is like food, or while I am content with the wild rose scent that is like memory, this name suddenly is cried out to me from somewhere in the bushes by a bird over and over again, a pure thrush word. So that's perhaps the same thing that Andrew was pointing out with the unknown bird. There is just this kind of willingness to stop and say, no, I'm not going to understand what that thrush is
Exactly.
saying.
Exactly.
It's a bird, I'm a human. There's a kind of beautiful gap between us.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I think that Hughes's quite early poem, Thrushes, which comes in Lupercal, and I'm always sad about how he ends up, how this poem ends up, because I think it just starts as amazing as any poem can be, and then it kind of goes a bit crazy, but that is what Hughes does. But most of all, it's just got such a different, it's got these beautiful, endless, long monosyllables, which is a real Hughes thing. He kind of slides these monosyllables together. It's like skimming a stone. There's a real beauty to the sort of flat shapes of his lines. So I just thought I'd read it just for a different sound of thrushes. Terrifying are the attent, sleek thrushes on the lawn, more coiled steel than living. A poised, dark, deadly eye, those delicate legs triggered to stirrings beyond sense. With a start, a bounce, a stab, overtake the instant and drag out some writhing thing. No indolent procrastinations and no yawning stares. No sighs or head scratchings. Nothing but bounce and stab and a ravening second. Is it their single mind-sized skulls, or a trained body, or genius, or a nestful of brats gives their days this bullet and automatic purpose? Mozart's brain had it, and the shark's mouth that hungers down the blood smell even to a leak of its own side and devouring of itself. Efficiency which strikes too streamlined for any doubt to pluck at it or obstruction deflect. With a man, it is otherwise. Heroism on horseback, outstripping his desk diary at a broad desk, carving at a tiny ivory ornament for years. His act worships itself, while for him, though he bends to be blent in the prayer, how loud and above what furious spaces of fire do the distracting devils, orgy and hosanna, under what wilderness of black, silent waters weep. I just find it so courageous what Hughes does, and you can hear the courage in those strong sounds. I think it is literally a kind of a determination to sort of really meet, and not only meet but overtake the sort of the violence of something that's not yourself. Whereas, you know, I think it is true, or is it true, Andrew, to say that Thomas is happy with something in the corner of his eye. He doesn't need necessarily to sort of encounter its otherness. He allows its otherness to be at the periphery. Would you say that's?
I think that's exactly right. In fact, I think that he prefers things in the corner of his eye, really, partly because it excuses him from any temptation that he might otherwise have to anthropomorphize and close the gap between human experience and the experience of the creature itself. But also because it allows all kinds of, I'm going to start using the same words again, all sorts of nebulous alternative possibilities to linger rather than coming down on one side of the question or the other. I mean, Frost was absolutely right about the way in which Thomas lived in at least two minds most of the time. And I think that, so it suits him very well to register his apprehension of things in ways that allows for that, for all kinds of ambiguities and alternatives to simultaneously coexist.
Do you think that however much we try to, I wouldn't use the word capture actually, which I think Jeremy used at the beginning, but however much we try to absorb or communicate the natural world that's around us, actually, as is evidenced by the poems we've just shown, poems do end up being portraits of the self, no matter what you try.
Very much so, yes. I mean, one of the things that's always struck me about Hughes's poems, and actually about many of yours too, is that both of you, often in extremely successful ways, use language in a way that is actually imitative of the thing that you're writing about. I mean, when I read, for instance, Ted's poems about swifts, the language in that poem is well, actually, I think there are more than one poem about swifts by him, isn't there? But in all his poems about swifts, let's say, the language sort of whizzes around the sky, as it were, in the same way that the swifts do. But that's not what Thomas is interested in doing. Thomas is much more interested in allowing to remain at a distance from himself.
I find that utterly fascinating, whether you want, I think poetry, I always feel it at its kind of, at its most ancient, it does give a capacity to, it gives you the chance to swap selves. You can become whatever you're communicating with. But
and it's
there's also something very wonderful about those poets like Thomas and probably Clare and Hardy and Frost who remain human.
Absolutely. Can I ask you about what you think about one thing in the beautiful poem, The Word, that you read, which is, it's always been very interesting to me that he uses the word name so much in the poem. He's made to think about names by saying that I forgot two names of the mighty men. I mean, that's the first time the word name appears, name or names. So that kind of licenses him to use the word name for what you might otherwise expect him to say as sound or song or something. But clearly,
I completely noticed that myself and really love it. And my sense is that it's a word that's so incomprehensible that it can only really be a proper noun.
Yes, yes.
I think there's a Borges story, isn't there, about a strange character who makes that he has no common nouns. Everything is a proper noun because he sees everything so entirely as an individual. Yes. So I feel that it's such a beautiful kind of surrender to his own ignorance that this word can only be can only have the mystery of a name. That's my sense of it.
No, absolutely. I mean, names are both ways of holding something for us humans, aren't they? Containing something, but also simultaneously registering that it is uncontainable.
Yeah, they're a sort of admission that you cannot conceptualize something. You can simply point it out. So it's a sort of, it's got the forcefulness of the word this or the word I. You know, a name is just endlessly particular.
And actually, Thomas himself has something very interesting to say about this, and that the use of the word name or names in the word always makes me think of the beginning of the poem by Thomas, which I think is my favorite of all his poems, actually, which is only the fourth poem he wrote, which is the poem called Old Man, which, as you probably remember, begins, old man or lad's love, in the name there's nothing, to one that knows not lad's love or old man, the whole green feathery herb, almost a tree, growing with rosemary and lavender. Even to one that knows it well, the names half decorate, half perplex the thing it is. At least what that is clings not to the names in spite of time, and yet I like the names. So that sort of two-mindedness, again, that we've registered it as working in sort of general ways, is very tightly focused on the two-mindedness that the word name triggers in him.
Yeah, the half decorating, half perplexing, which is quite a good description, actually, of all the poems, really.
It is, absolutely. That's very much my feeling. And then on the facing page, I mean, I was perhaps going to come to this later, but this is obviously the moment to say it. In the previous poem that he wrote, the poem called March, he says, what did the thrushes know? Well, whatever it is that they know is, to his simultaneous frustration and delight, not really knowable quite by him. And he can hear the message, but he can't entirely understand it.
And that sort of, I think, means that I'm very interested that the overriding thing I take away from his poetry is a rather sweet melancholy.
Yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think you have to be, yes, you have to be quite brave to go away with that, rather than, you know, the sort of many transformative things than poetry can do.
Indeed,
To be
indeed.
happy to give and live with melancholy
Yeah,
is,
absolutely.
I
Yes.
admire it.
Yeah, so do I, very much.
Fascinating. I just wondered whether we might touch on something about perhaps Thomas's influence on poets writing during the last 3/4 of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st century.
I mean, I'm happy to say a few things about this. They'll be rather sort of untethered, I'm afraid. And I hope perhaps we might at some point come back to the question of what it actually do you mind, Jeremy, if I just put that on hold? Because
Yes, no, of course.
I'd very much like to, I do want to speak to that, but and thank you for the question. But can I ask Alice what she thinks the birds actually are saying? I mean, what do the thrushes know? I mean,
Yeah.
I've been cudgeling my brains about this over the last few days while thinking about what we might be talking about today. And perhaps it's a mistake even to think what, in human terms, exactly what it is that they might be saying, but it clearly has something to do with belonging. And they belong in their place in a way that Thomas, feels that he can't quite as a human. I mean, whatever the dangers and threats surrounding their lives, they are part of it in a way that he isn't quite in his own environment. He talks in one of the prose books about himself as a superfluous man, taking the phrase, I think, from, is it Chekhov? Anyway, it's not his own phrase, but it suits him very well. So deracinated, ill at ease, and of course, by the time that he's writing poems with one eye on whether he's going to join up, and then once he has joined up, what the war might hold in store for him. So something about belonging, and something which is perhaps a version of the same point about simply being, not meaning, but being, and that being enough in a way that other poets, many other poets who've written about birds, won't quite accept, because they're always trying to understand and interpret and decode and generally sort of be exegetical about things. Does that seem right to you, Alice? Are those your sorts of feelings about it as well?
I love all those thoughts. And it's such a wonderful question. You know, what is the thrush saying? Because of course there is no answer at all.
Right.
I think that actually I recently read in this book about Gaelic poetry that I've been reading, that they said that the merle, which is the blackbird, speaks a lament, but the mavis, the thrush, speaks a salute. So that's one answer.
Oh, that's interesting. That is interesting.
But I think I would see all these bird songs, bird sounds as possibly comparable to what I think is it Valerie who says that prose is a way of walking and poetry a way of dancing. I can't remember exactly how he says it, but I've always really loved that distinction between a way of using language where you're getting somewhere and a way of using language where you're simply delighting in twirling. And I think, to me, I understand birds best as a kind of equivalent of dance in speech, where you really are sort of ecstatically expressing the sort of delight of the moment.
Yeah.
but I definitely have no clue whether that's right or not.
No,
And
and well, I mean, it makes sense to me, but in a sense, nor should we have any sense beyond that, I think.
and of course, all the birds are saying something different, though. I mean, similar perhaps to your starling that you quoted,
Mm.
there used to be a bunch of ravens where I used to walk up the hill where we lived in Devon. And I mean, they were so articulate and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
very nearly saying something sensible
Yeah.
that it was really quite kind of shocking sometimes.
Yes, quite.
And again, I
Right.
couldn't quite make it out, but there was definitely an element of mockery in
Yeah,
it.
yeah, interesting.
So,
Very
so I
interesting.
think it would be interesting to go through all the birds and discover
Yeah.
what they're saying.
Yes, I mean, it is worth, just quickly off the back of that, it is worth saying that to a very unusual degree, Thomas's perception of individual birds is very well individuated. I mean, I think a lot of poets who don't know much about birds just sort of bung them in there, or happen to hear one in passing. But to the great majority of poets, they are little brown blobs just sort of flying around. But when Thomas says peewit or sedge warbler or thrush or blackbird, he really knows what he's talking about. And even though he's not able, as we're saying, not able to say exactly what it is that they're saying, he realizes the difference between them, and that is an important aspect.
I think that's important, and that does feel that puts him quite close to Claire in my mind,
It does,
because
doesn't it?
I get
Very
that
much
feeling
so.
from Claire that
Yeah, me too.
he's really noticing
Yeah,
the different flight patterns,
yeah,
the different
yeah,
voices, the different
yeah.
nests.
And actually, very often there, I mean, Thomas generally is not very aligned with the sort of mythical ideas that you were talking about in relation to Hughes, though I suppose his long early poem, The Other, is a bit of an exception, proving the rule. But he, as he notices the difference, or as he registers the difference between different kinds of birds, he is alive to their resonance and to their mythologies, as it were, I think. Which
Did
again
you
is,
have one in mind?
well, I was just thinking really about thrushes, because behind that thrush that you were reading about, and there are several other thrushes in the poems, it's very difficult not to hear a poem that was already famous, even though it hadn't been written many years before, which is Hardy's Darkling Thrush. Because very often when a thrush does sing in a Thomas poem, incomprehensible in strictly human terms as it might be, it's also it's generally uplifting, partly because it reminds him that spring will come back again, that the seasons will rotate, the world will turn, whatever happens to him individually and that bird individually. So you might say that this thrush is aware of a hope. I'm sort of quoting the end of the Darkling Thrush as I'm saying this, of which, well, in the Hardy poem, Hardy says that he's unaware of it, but he clocks it as soon as the thrush says it. And Thomas too is sort of animated, rejuvenated almost by hearing thrushes sing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was very noticeable to me when we moved from Devon to Bristol that this sudden kind of absence of daily hope, the daily dose of hope from the dawn chorus,
How
was
interesting.
really, really noticeable when it wasn't
Yes.
there.
How interesting. How
So
interesting. Well,
I'm suddenly aware of the time and wondering whether there are questions we should be answering from the floor.
Yeah. So we've got one question from Laura, who says many thanks for this great discussion. Do you see a connection between Thomas and Elizabeth Bishop?
You probably know a correct answer to that, do you, Andrew? I could
I wish I did.
but I don't know.
I wish I did. I know that Bishop read Thomas, but which is quite pioneering of her, actually, because she would have been doing her reading in the days before this rise in his fame that we opened by talking about, and also pioneering in the sense that even though that alteration in the contour of his reputation has changed in the UK, he's still largely unknown over here. I mean, I've made it one of my American missions to make sure that people do read him more widely over here. But if he's known at all, he's known as the Friend of Frost, and that's kind of it. He is seriously underread here. So it was pioneering of her to do this. Presumably, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, the person nicely asking.
Laura.
Laura. Presumably, Laura, you're thinking of poems like The Sandpiper in Bishop. I don't know whether you're able to.
Let me, yeah, I've just unmuted Laura. So Laura, would you like to join
Yes, no,
the
she's
discussion?
kindly just said yes. Well, I mean, I think I love The Sandpiper and I love Elizabeth Bishop. Who doesn't love Elizabeth Bishop? The only thing that disturbs me about Elizabeth Bishop is that everybody likes her. It doesn't seem quite right to me that everybody should like the same person, but I do like her very much and admire her a great deal. But that poem too, rather in the kind of Frostian way that we were talking about, is interested in interpretation, isn't it, of what the bird does and is. It's finicky, it's a student of Blake. It has this sort of scholarly way of walking. It's endlessly kind of quizzically turning over the little grains of quartz and so on. And that seems more aligned. Well, I mean, that's a brilliant description of what the bird's doing, but it's in interrogative manner, is a step beyond the kind of ambivalences and edge of consciousness type things that we were talking about in Thomas, I think.
So, although I think I would interpret Bishop's poem more as they're sort of kind of flashes of metaphorical vision, I would say. I don't think she's really saying what the bird's doing.
Yeah.
She's seeing by means of metaphor what the bird feels like.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. I was just thinking about the kind of caution of like the way it's very mysterious, that the same kind of quality in Thomas.
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, the way that Bishop continually sort of tacks and realigns herself in the course of pretty much all her poems, with an eye to being more accurate, getting to the truth of the matter, and then admitting that perhaps there is some sort of inevitable falling short. That is akin to what we're talking about in Thomas, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. I think we've got time for at least one more question, hopefully another one. But Caroline asks, in the manner that Clare is considered the Northamptonshire poet, because of the way in which his home and vicinity plays such an important part in his poetry, can we say that Thomas is a Hampshire poet?
Hampshire today, tomorrow the world.
He definitely feels sort of southern England, I'd say, doesn't he?
Very much so.
And possibly a southern England that I don't know. I wonder if it's even there anymore, because the south of England now is so sort of built over, isn't it? So it does, to me, have that. I feel quite sad when I read these poems, because I wonder how much of that particular kind of landscape is still there. But perhaps someone will tell me it is.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, it's 10 years since I've lived in England, but and I do have many memories of tramping around around Petersfield, and feeling that he was quite close, and that at least the sort of basic shapes of the country were more or less the same. I absolutely can hear what you're saying about the overbuiltness, but what it's making me thinking about this is how, if we think about the way, for instance, his contemporary Houseman writes about landscape and about the things in a landscape, that's already a country of the mind in Houseman's poems, in a way that it isn't in Thomas. Thomas's landscapes still feel real. In fact, they don't really even, at least except towards the end of his writing life, they don't betray that sense of actuality. But as Alice, you and I were saying the other day, I feel there is an increasing interest as his writing goes on towards a more symbolist way of writing. And I feel very tempted to suspect that if he had been spared, if he hadn't been killed, that is a strain that would have developed in him. But I like to think that he would still have seen the real shapes of things, but perhaps amped up their metaphoric value a little bit more. Both because I think that's the way his mind was tending, and after all, it would suit that mixture of observant looking, sharp-eyedness and literary awareness to move in
and
that
the sort of
direction.
dream quality. I think
Exactly.
it's such a tantalizing thought.
It is, but
Yeah.
I think that if he had lived to read The Wasteland, for instance, and the poems being written sort of in the curtilage of the wasteland, that would have accelerated his move towards that way of writing, because that's what one of the things they were doing themselves.
Yeah.
Yes, I like that thought of him being a poet of the South Country, which was the
That seems
book
right to me.
the
Absolutely.
book that Frost picked up as being one of his most poetic.
Indeed.
So perhaps that's a better way of saying it, and that's me living in Thomas Country saying that. But
Exactly.
yeah, I think I love that. I think a poet of the South Country is an apt definition, on which I have to sadly draw this fascinating and interesting conversation to a close. I can't believe that hour has flown past so quickly. Thank you very much, Andrew.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Alice. I think on behalf of everybody, I can say thank you.